Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 35 of Truth is Justice. This week, we'll continue our look at the defence reply brief, but before I start on that, just some short observations on some aspects of the way this case has been covered by some. Some of you will have noticed that episodes over the last few weeks have been released a day or two later than usual. The reason for that is I'm currently travelling with my family in Eastern Europe, meaning my schedule is a little up in the air from one day to the next. A place that really surprised me was Sarajevo. The people are amazing. It's possibly the most tourist-friendly place I've ever visited, but one thing in particular moved me, and it brought into sharp focus one of the really frustrating parts for me about how the Melgar case has been covered, by Bob in particular. Now, true injustice is shocking. And shocking probably doesn't even go far enough. It is the thing of nightmares. True injustice means no due process, and no right to a fair trial. I mean, forget complaints about whether the crime scene investigator didn't take more photos of a back door. True injustice will see you facing judgment on the whim of an individual in a position of power. Of course, everything's relevant, right? I mean, experiences during wartime are different from those in the American justice system. I agree. But I also think, for some, the language used has tried to invoke some of these emotions. Torture, for example. True torture is unthinkable horror. Do a search on the atrocities from the Bosnian War. And torture, it's beyond the thing of nightmares. It's beyond comprehension for me how people can withstand such physical and psychological attacks. Yet, Bob had the nerve, I guess the disrespect, to claim that Sandra's interview with detectives Duce and Carazal was torture. I mean, seriously, if you believe that interview, complete with being offered 2 cups of water, is torture, your understanding of truly shocking events, including torture, is very limited. I'm of the strong view that Sandra's interview did not even remotely approach torture. For people like Bob to claim that is to disrespect everyone that has withstood true torture. To somehow compare the unthinkable horrors many people have suffered to Sandra's interview is ridiculous in the extreme. And corruption, true corruption, is brutally overt, with terrifying results that would shake you to your core. I've read and heard some truly absurd claims about corruption in the Melgar case. They range from suggesting that the conspiracy to pin Jim's murder on Sandra began even before the first responder arrived, and the claims that this case has become so important to the justice system generally that the appeals court itself is involved in conspiring to ensure that Sandra remains behind bars. I've heard some funny things, but to suggest that Sandra was convicted of Jim's murder only because of widespread corruption is an intellectually insulting proposition. I even read on the Facebook page associated with Bob's show, where there exists the belief that Sandra's medical treatment, including her access to medication, is being interfered with in an attempt to prevent her successfully directing her counsel to handle her appeal correctly. I mean, it's laughable. Sandra received a fair trial, and her verdict was just. The DA's office have been incredibly transparent in their handling of the case, including Ms. Barnett herself bringing this matter to the attention of Ms. Zellner, and then providing her with full access to the case material. Suggested corruption and conspiracy claims are beyond absurd, firmly in the realm of flat earth theories, and like the torture suggestions, are so disrespectful to true cases of torture and injustice and corruption. The games, deceit, and public manipulation have been from one side, and one side only, Sandra's defence team, members of her family, and Bob through his coverage of the case on his show. Our focus here, Truth is Justice, has been to get to the truth, and we have done so politely, respectfully, and objectively. Despite approaching the case in that way, we have been met every step of the way with fierce criticism and altogether ridiculous attempts to silence us and to try and make us look away through intimidation. As we continue with this project and move on to our next case, post Jim Melgar, you can be assured that we will present all future case information fully, objectively, and without a predetermined view of guilt or innocence. We are simply determined to publish the truth. And we will do so whether that is the popular opinion or not. We will do that even if people disagree with us and threaten us. We are Truth is Justice, and we are setting the record straight. Finishing our review of the defence reply brief, on page 22 is commentary on the knife wounds inflicted on Jim. It's quite interesting for various reasons, and it reads as follows, so to quote from the brief. The state on appeal trumpets a theory that was hatched, at least in part, for the first time at trial by the prosecutor in final argument, that there was a necessary correlation between the depth of Jim's stab wounds and the relative brawn, or lack thereof, of the killer, i.e., since his wounds only penetrated 3 inches, the killer had to be Sandy, because that's not something that somebody is, like tall and strong. They're going all the way to the hilt. Hers were not that deep. That fits her height, fits with her weight. On appeal, the state characterises Jim's stab wounds as weak knife attacks. No expert testimony was offered into evidence by the prosecution which remotely addressed, much less established, that theory. It is supported by no evidence whatsoever and is complete nonsense. It is quite telling, in and of itself, that the prosecution never asked Dr. Pineri if there was any scientific or forensic basis to support this supposition. I say interesting because it is this very conclusion that Bob himself arrived at with respect to a female attacking Jim, based on, amongst other things, the knife wounds. Imagine someone telling Bob that such a claim, such a conclusion based on the autopsy information, was a ludicrous proposition. I'd imagine you'd be mercilessly ridiculed as a non-believer of Bob's, and all further opinions you offer up would be rapidly dismissed. Well, ludicrous proposition is exactly how the defence describes such claims. And to quote from the brief again, in fact, the forensic literature rejects such a ludicrously inaccurate proposition. The force needed for a knife to perforate the skin depends on the configuration and sharpness of the tip of the knife. The sharper, more needle-like the tip, the more readily it will perforate the skin. Once the tip has perforated the skin, the rest of the blade will slide into the body with ease. As long as it does not contact bone, a knife can readily pass through organs with very little force. Thus, even if a knife blade is driven its complete length into the body, this does not necessarily mean that the stab wound was inflicted with great force. Now, you can all decide whether the quote offered up by the defence actually supports their argument. I'm not entirely sure it does. It does suggest that a knife can pass through organs with very little force, but it doesn't deal at all with an attack situation, a situation where the individual being stabbed is trying to avoid being stabbed. In that situation, I think the claims made with respect to a female attacker, and I will add, an attacker Jim possibly didn't want to or couldn't inflict serious injury on, are not challenged at all by the defence in this reply. Now on page 25, we have a reference by the defence to the blood on the safe handle, specifically to a supposed fingerprint on the handle. And the brief reads as follows. Once again, the state omits any reference to another curious aspect of this case. The handle of a safe in the bedroom closet appeared to have a bloody fingerprint on it, and yet CSU investigators and detectives never made any effort to swab the handle for possible DNA or fingerprints. And this is definitely another example of the defence hoping for a less than thorough review of the records by the appeals court when absorbing the reply brief. The claimed fingerprint on the safe handle was specifically addressed at trial by Ms. Barnett in her questions asked of Mr. Carpenter. And specifically, the interaction proceeds at trial as follows. Question from Ms. Barnett. Did you come to receive another set of photographs of the safe after you had finished taking pictures in your investigation on this case? Answer by Mr. Carpenter. Yes. Question. Who did you receive the photos from? Answer. From you. Question. Alright. And were you able to tell if they were closer photos on the safe or not? Answer. Yes, they were. Question. And were you able to tell whether or not there is a print that could be analysed from the safe? Answer. There were no prints on the safe. Question. Was it a picture of the safe was it the same? Let me back up for a minute. The picture you had on the safe, with the blood on the handle, was this a similar picture, but taken by someone else? Answer. The handle appeared to have been treated with something, or something appeared to have been applied to the handle to alter the colouring of it. Question. Were you able to tell in this picture whether or not a print could be lifted from the handle of the safe? Answer. Yes. Question. And could you? Answer. There was no print on the safe handle. So, that seems pretty conclusive, right? On page 26, reference is made to Sandra's hands being immediately bagged. The reply brief reads as follows. Of particular import, Sandy's hands were immediately placed in paper bags by investigators at the scene to preserve the integrity of any evidence that might be on them. Now, many of you would be aware of the timeline of events commencing when Sandra was discovered in the closet by Herman and Maria. Not only did a significant period of time pass between Sandra's discovery and the bagging of her hands, but during that time, the testimony of Deputy Martinez is that Sandra made 3 trips to the restroom for up to 20 minutes. Reflected by the fact that Sandra washed her hands with water, her hands during that period were clearly not bagged. Now, the defence selected its words carefully in this respect, but the suggestion of Sandra's hands being immediately bagged, irrespective of who bagged them, gives the impression that Sandra's hands were bagged shortly after her discovery in the closet. That, of course, is entirely misleading. Again, on page 26, the defence makes reference to Sandra's fingernails, specifically the condition of her nails. And this is the wording they use, and to quote from the brief. All of Sandy's fingernails were intact, with no breaks or chips. Now, please go to our website and refresh your memory of how Sandra's fingernails look. I'm not by any means claiming to be knowledgeable on manicurial matters, but in my lay opinion, suggestions that Sandra's fingernails are intact and without breaks or chips seems to be a very flattering description of them. On page 27, the reply brief suggests that no bloody clothing was found at the crime scene, and to quote from the brief, and no bloody clothing was found in the house. Now, it's interesting how that reads. Again, I'd suggest that many of Bob's followers would be furious at the suggestion that no blood-stained clothing was found at the house. Remember, the Costco blouse was one of Bob's biggest claims. If you read through that section of the brief on pages 26 and 27, you'll see the context. Now, I was fortunate enough last week to view some photos, and thank you very much to Ms. Rossi for displaying those, of 6 scenes set up for a bloodstain class. Real blood was used, and Ms. Rossi was one of the subjects. There was a significant amount of blood. And the subject cleaned off the blood in a white shower with a white washcloth and dried herself with a white towel. The towel and washcloth, the washcloth was literally covered in blood, were cleaned only with water. The result? A pristine white shower and surrounds, and a pristine washcloth and towel. No chemicals were used, but the scene was pristine. Now, before making assessments on what should be expected in and around the Melgar bathroom, think about what could be achieved with a jacuzzi that could be refilled countless times and a washing machine if necessary. Thank you very much again to Ms. Rossi for sharing those images with me. Now, on page 27, reference is made to Ms. Rossi's statement about the process of turning gloves inside out, a process that would allow you to avoid contact with the blood or transferring the blood elsewhere. Specifically, the wording used in the brief is as follows. There was no evidence of blood transfer associated with removing bloody clothing or gloves. Deputy Rossi testified that someone with a level of sophistication could take gloves off and turn them into each other and put them in their pocket, thereby leaving the crime scene without a trace. But Sandy was not shown to have any level of sophistication to do so. Now, if any of you have ever completed advanced first aid courses, you would probably be familiar with that process. In fact, I would assume those of you that have ever used disposable gloves would know how to remove them without touching the substance on the gloves and managing to turn the gloves inside out. Importantly, remember Sandra was a nurse. It would come as a huge surprise to me if Sandra didn't have the knowledge of how to handle disposable gloves. On page 28, reference is made to no evidence of the smell of Clorox in the Melgar home. Now, this is a real head-scratcher from the defence. And here is how they word it. As for cleaning the scene, the state's argument is dead on arrival. There was zero evidence that the scene was cleaned. The reference in its brief to a mop and bucket with water that smelled like Clorox is disingenuous when the testimony showed that there was no odour of Clorox anywhere in the house. There were several doggy pee pads and faeces on the floor, and Carpenter determined that the mop and bucket were not relevant. And here is the trial testimony from Deputy Martinez. Question from Ms. Barnett. Did you notice anything? Any cleaning materials in there? Answer from Deputy Martinez. In the kitchen, or back toward the dining room area, there was a bucket which smelled like Clorox, a real strong odour, and a mop, and then there was little strips of pieces of paper around the whole house, and in the living room there was a vacuum cleaner, with the shredded paper in the vacuum cleaner. Question from Ms. Barnett. Alright, when you said that there was a smell of Clorox, where did you smell that? Answer. Coming from the bucket. Question. Okay. Answer. I was standing maybe 2 feet away from it, and I could smell the aroma of Clorox or bleach. I'm assuming it was Clorox. You know, just that smell. Question. Like a cleaning material type smell. Answer. Yes. How the claim can be made by the defence that the testimony showed that there was no odour of Clorox anywhere in the house is absolutely beyond me. Is it a case, once again, of the defence not doing their homework, or is it a case of trying to ignore clear, unambiguous trial testimony? I don't know. Either way, it is a strange, perhaps even careless, claim for the defence to have made. On page 29, we have the defence suggesting no credible evidence that Sandra left the house on the evening of the 22nd of December 2012. The specific wording they use is this. Carpenter testified that he would expect if someone committed a murder and did not leave the house that they would have cleaned up in the house. Detective Doucet testified that based on the HCSO investigation, no credible evidence was received that Sandy ever left the house that night. The interesting part of that is Bob's pursuit of the matter of the neighbour's surveillance video. Now, you'd all recall that. The bold claims by Bob of identifying from the surveillance video a vehicle potentially pulling in and leaving the Melgars home. It was hugely speculative, as is Bob's tendency, but importantly, in my opinion, that whole approach is potentially more deeply problematic for Sandra and the defence than it is for the prosecution. I say, with a reasonably high level of certainty, that both the defence and the prosecution were well aware of the vehicle activity covered on the Melgars street on the evening of the 22nd of December 2012 and the morning of the 23rd of December 2012. I'm of the opinion that the defence purposefully didn't raise the vehicle activity, and further, it's my view that the attention Bob drew to the activity was something not particularly welcomed by Sandra's defence team. Not because it has any impact on the appeal, but because it draws attention, public attention, to a matter that they would rather have left as an unknown, similar to the IT matter and the unknown female number 1 DNA. And finally, the footnote on page 32, the reply brief, reads as follows. Sandy and Jim had a wonderful, caring and loving relationship, and no motive was established for Sandy to have murdered him, a fact virtually conceded by the state. Now, one of the significant downsides to a crowdsourced investigation, requested, promoted and participated in by the daughter of the convicted murderer, is the potential for a full picture of the family environment to be obtained. From the Reddit posts, to the very short anniversary dinner, to the planned trip that Sandra is going to take without Jim, to the dozens of internet dating sites visited on the computers and the large number of pornography websites visited. We have an insight into the family dynamics that is very different to that which was painted by the defence, by the family and also by Bob. And that's something that I've never really understood. With nothing to hide, there is no value in not being entirely upfront. everything usually comes out, as has been the case with those items I raised just then. The only valid reason to paint the family environment in a different way to what it actually was is to support a narrative. A narrative that I feel has been systematically torn apart over the past year through the identification of multiple pieces of relevant material that has been truly damning for Sandra. In my opinion, the defence brief is evidence of just how comprehensive all the various pieces of the case against Sandra really are. Thank you for listening to Truth is Justice, and we look forward to you joining us next week as we continue to set the record straight.